like to point out two things before I begin my meditation today. And the first is something I talk about once in a while here at the church, and that's the power of Scripture when it is read as sacred story rather than taken literally. To me, the claim or attempt to take the Scriptures literally robs them of their power, because these stories weren't first told, written down, edited, and saved by their communities to be read as a science text or a history text as we think of those things today. The Scriptures weren't created to lay heavy creedal or ritualistic burdens on people, nor were they set down to predict anything other than how to live a fully human life full of God's love. Scripture is meant to be heard as story, as sacred story that evokes the liberating power of God at work in the world in mysterious ways, and that provokes a change in our own hearts in the form of a greater openness to that liberating power. So if we read the story of Samuel looking for prophetic predictions or rules for living, or if we read it and just can't get into it because of the miraculous sort of fantastic dimensions of the story, we miss the beauty and power of what's there. I mean, imagine the scene that was described in that passage. In a time of cultural decline, when no one seemed to hear God's voice and when visions were rare, we see a young boy asleep in a beautiful sanctuary, a beautiful holy tent, the holy tabernacle of the people of Israel at Shiloh. You can almost hear the breeze rustling the tent and imagine the flickering light of the holy lamp that was lit inside, representing God's presence. The boy is an apprentice to an old priest whose fading sight clearly represents in the story the fading vision of the old priestly order. Something new is in the air this night, a voice on the breeze, Samuel, Samuel. The old priest can't hear it, only the boy. And every time the boy hears it, he declares his willingness to serve, to be part of whatever it is that is being asked of him. Here I am, he keeps saying. And to the old priest's credit, even though he knows the voice has come to announce that his time is up, urges the boy to embrace the new call from God. And that's what Samuel does. Such a great story with beautiful imagery. When we enter into Scripture with a listening ear and a holy imagination, we see ourselves in the stories. In the old priest who needs to step aside, perhaps, or in the young boy ready to receive a new call in his life. We see ourselves and we hear the voice of God still speaking to us on the winds of change in our own time. That's the power of Scripture when it is heard not literally, but as sacred story. The second thing I want to say briefly this morning is that if you've not read the speeches of Martin Luther King Jr., I urge you to take the time to do it. I never cease to be amazed by the depth of his insight and the relevance of his thought even 50 years later. For example, in the drum major instinct, which Ed read from in the first reading, King talked about the ways in which that instinct, which all of us have, he says, can distort a personality if it's not recognized and harnessed. And I'd just like to read a few snippets and see if this reminds you of anyone in the public eye today. He wrote, "There comes a time when the drum major instinct can become destructive." And that's where I want to move now. I want to move to the point of saying that if this instinct is not harnessed, it becomes a very dangerous, pernicious instinct. For instance, if it isn't harnessed, it causes one's personality to become distorted. I guess that's the most damaging aspect of it, what it does to the personality. If it isn't harnessed, you will end up day in and day out trying to deal with your ego problem by boasting. Have you ever heard people like that? You know, and I'm sure you've met them, that really become sickening because they just sit up all the time talking about themselves. And they just boast and boast and boast. And that's the person who has not harnessed the drum major instinct. And then it does other things to the personality. It causes you to lie about who you know sometimes. There are some people who are influence peddlers, and in their attempt to deal with the drum major instinct, they have to try to identify with the so-called big-name people And if you're not careful, they will make you think they know somebody that they don't really know. He goes on, and then the final great tragedy of the distorted personality is the fact that when one fails to harness this instinct, he ends up by trying to push others down in order to push himself up. And whenever you do that, you engage in some of the most vicious activities. You will spread evil, vicious, lying gossip on people because you are trying to pull them down in order to push yourself up. And the great issue of life is to harness the drum major instinct.